Welcome back. It's good to have you here again. Let the world fade away for a moment and allow yourself to be swept into a tale where mystery and calm intertwine. Take a deep breath and let's begin once more. The clock struck midnight, but something was wrong. The chimes echoed louder than ever before, and then silence. Only the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved through the house, though no one was there. Was it the ticking of time, or something far darker waiting to be discovered? Stay with me, and let's unravel the mystery together. Chapter 1. The Silent Visitor. The soft, crackling sound of the fire was the only noise in the room. The day had faded into evening, and 221B Baker Street had settled into its usual quiet rhythm. A faint smell of tobacco and freshly brewed tea lingered in the air as Sherlock Holmes, seated by the hearth, appeared lost in thought. His long fingers rested lightly on the arm of his chair, the tips tapping gently, almost absent-mindedly, as he stared into the flickering flames. Dr. John Watson, sitting across from him with his medical journal open, glanced up from time to time, noting the silence that seemed unusually thick in the air. It was not the kind of quiet Watson was used to, where Holmes would be absorbed in one of his cases or, as of late, in his rare moments of relaxation. No, this was a different sort of stillness, the kind that made the hairs on the back of Watson's neck prickle ever so slightly. "Holmes," Watson finally said, his voice breaking through the stillness. "You are unusually quiet tonight. You seem preoccupied." Holmes didn't immediately respond, his gaze still fixed on the fire. Watson wondered if perhaps the great detective was lost in thought, or if something was subtly troubling him. Then, without looking away from the flames, Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're correct, Watson. I am waiting." Watson leaned forward, intrigued. Waiting for what? Holmes's eyes flickered toward the window. The evening was deepening, shadows lengthening outside. "Something, or rather, someone," he said, his voice barely more than a murmur. Watson's curiosity piqued, and before he could press further, there came a soft knock on the door, so faint it was nearly lost amid the quiet of the room. A chill crept through the air, and Watson rose to answer. He opened the door to reveal a figure standing just outside, shrouded in the faint glow of the street lamp. The man was tall, his face pale and tense, his clothes finely tailored but disheveled, as if he had walked straight from a troubled dream. His eyes were wide, dark circles beneath them, and there was something about him, something that stirred the air with an odd, unspoken tension. I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice cracking slightly, "but I am in desperate need of your assistance." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his posture still and calm. "You are?" He gave Watson a subtle glance before standing. "Please come in. Let's hear what troubles you." The man stepped into the room, his eyes darting nervously around, as though he expected something, or someone, to be watching. He closed the door behind him softly, locking it with a faint click. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls themselves had drawn in closer. "I am Edgar Millstone," the man introduced himself, his voice tremulous. "A clockmaker by trade. But I come to you not for repairs or advice on timepieces." "No." He hesitated, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the edge of his coat. "What I have come to you with is a matter of great urgency. I believe I am being haunted by time itself." Holmes's expression remained unreadable, though the hint of interest was unmistakable in his eyes. "Go on, Mr. Millstone," he said softly, motioning for him to sit. Millstone sank into the chair across from Holmes, wringing his hands nervously. "It's the clock," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The clock in my possession. My father's clock. It's been in my family for generations. At first it was just a simple antique. But recently, it has begun to behave in ways that defy logic. It strikes at odd hours, not just once, but sometimes more, sometimes none at all. Last night, it struck 12 times. At midnight, Holmes leaned forward, intrigued. "And you say this clock has never struck 12 before?" "Never. It has always struck only once at the hour," Millstone said, his face pale. "But last night, I was awakened by the sound of it ringing 12 times, echoing through the house. And after that, I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from within the walls. I swear it was not my imagination. I am certain of it, Mr. Holmes. The sound was real, but when I searched the house, there was no one." A shiver passed through the room, subtle but distinct. Watson looked to Holmes, who had not broken his gaze from Millstone, his expression a study of concentration. "Tell me," Holmes asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. "Does the clock hold any significance beyond its peculiar behavior?" Millstone's hands clenched, and he looked down, as if gathering the strength to speak. "My father, he always said that the clock was special, that it was more than a mere timepiece, that it carried something, a message perhaps, but he never explained. He died before I could ask him more, and now I fear it has become something else entirely." Holmes sat back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The clockmaker's story was intriguing, disturbing even, but there was more to it. As always, the mystery of the unknown had drawn Holmes in, and Watson could sense the growing tension in the air. "Mr. Millstone," Holmes said, breaking the silence, "you say the clock struck 12 last night at midnight, and you heard footsteps within the walls. It is clear there is something at play here, something hidden beneath the surface. We shall go to your workshop tomorrow and investigate this matter further. There are always explanations, though they are not always as we expect." Millstone nodded, but there was a lingering unease in his eyes. "I only hope that you can find the truth, Mr. Holmes. I fear it may be more than I can handle." As Millstone left the room, Holmes turned to Watson with a look of quiet resolve. "It seems, Watson, that our evening may be far from quiet. The question remains, who or what is truly behind the haunting of time itself?" The fire crackled softly, the shadows playing across the walls as Holmes turned back to the mystery at hand. The night had only just begun, and the puzzle before them would require more than just logic. It would demand every ounce of Holmes's remarkable intuition and skill. And Watson, ever the willing observer, was ready to follow. Chapter 2. The Whisper of Time. The following morning, a fog had settled over London, casting a soft, almost ethereal glow across the streets. The air felt damp, and a chill clung to everything, as if the very city was holding its breath. As Holmes and Watson made their way through the winding lanes toward Mr. Millstone's workshop, the atmosphere seemed to hum with quiet anticipation, the kind of stillness that precedes something unknown, something that lingers just beyond the edge of perception. As they approached the quaint shop nestled in the corner of the street, Holmes's keen eyes took in every detail. The windows were fogged with moisture, the sign above the door slightly crooked, but there was a certain charm to the place. Despite its age, it appeared well kept, as though it had been lovingly maintained by the clockmaker. The unmistakable sound of ticking, dozens, perhaps hundreds of clocks, drifted out from within, filling the air with a symphony of time. Mr. Millstone stood at the door, his face pale, his eyes dark circles beneath them, as if sleep had eluded him for far too long. He greeted them with a hurried nod, stepping aside to allow them entry. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said in a low, almost apologetic tone. "Thank you for coming. I'm afraid the situation has become more dire than I first explained." Holmes didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the room. The space was cluttered with clocks of every kind. Grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, pocket watches, each one ticking away, some louder than others, but all in sync with an unsettling harmony. "Where is the clock in question, Mr. Millstone?" Holmes finally asked, his voice a soft, steady murmur that seemed to blend effortlessly with the ticking of the clocks around them. Millstone led them to the back of the room, where a large, imposing grandfather clock stood in the center of the space. It was beautiful, crafted from dark oak, its face intricate with delicate gold engravings, its hands shaped like wisps of smoke. But there was something in its stillness, something about the way it seemed to absorb the light, that gave Holmes pause. "This is it," Millstone said, his voice wavering. "The clock that has been causing me so much distress. It hasn't chimed properly in years. But lately it's been behaving in ways I cannot explain." Holmes stepped closer, inspecting the clock. His eyes narrowed as he examined the craftsmanship, the carvings on the wood, the movement of the hands. But his focus didn't stay solely on the clock itself. There was something deeper in the air, a palpable tension, as if the very room were holding a secret. Watson, too, felt the weight of the silence in the room. It wasn't just the clocks. It was something more. The walls seemed to echo with an unspoken mystery, a whisper that was just beyond hearing, yet not entirely absent. Holmes reached out and touched the face of the clock, running his fingers lightly over the delicate brass hands. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, as if in response to his touch, the clock let out a faint, almost imperceptible click, like the softest whisper of a voice, just barely audible. Watson froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was so faint, so subtle that he wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. But Holmes's expression remained focused, his gaze fixed on the clock as if he'd been waiting for this very sound. "Aha," Holmes muttered softly, almost to himself. "There it is." He stepped back, his fingers still tingling from the faint touch. "Mr. Millstone, you mentioned that the clock had begun striking at odd hours. When did you first notice this change?" Millstone, clearly on edge, swallowed hard before answering. "It began about 2 weeks ago. At first it was just a few strange moments. A ring here, a ring there, when I hadn't set it to strike. But last night, it struck 12 times at midnight, and that's when I..." He stopped, his voice faltering. Holmes turned slowly to face him, his eyes soft but intense. "What happened last night, Mr. Millstone?" The clockmaker hesitated for a long moment, as if gathering the courage to speak. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I heard footsteps. Not from outside the room, but from within the walls. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking inside the house. I searched every room, every corner, but found nothing. And then the clock struck 12, and the footsteps stopped." A cold shiver ran down Watson's spine. He had heard stories of haunted houses, of ghosts and spirits. But something about Millstone's words struck him as more than just a tale of a restless spirit. The clock was somehow tied to this. Its strange behavior, the footsteps within the walls. The clock was the source of something far deeper, far more elusive. Holmes was already moving, examining the clock with renewed focus. His hands brushed over the wood again, his fingers tracing the patterns of the intricate engravings. There was something hidden here, something within the clock itself that called out to him, though he couldn't yet put a name to it. The ticking grew louder, almost as if in response to Holmes's touch. With every second, it seemed to fill the room more completely, as if the very rhythm of the clocks was beginning to pulse with a life of its own. Holmes stepped back, his brow furrowed, lost in thought. "Mr. Millstone, I believe your clock holds more than just the passing of time. It holds something deeper, something that has been waiting." Millstone looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes? What is it waiting for?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step back and glanced at the other clocks in the room. It was as if the entire workshop had shifted, as though the clocks were all suddenly connected in some unspoken way. Air felt heavier now, thicker, as if time itself had become a living thing, pressing in on them. "I need to investigate further," Holmes said quietly. "But be warned, Mr. Millstone, this may not be as simple as we hope. The clock may hold a secret, one that reaches far beyond mere mechanics." The room grew silent once more, the ticking of the clocks now filling the air like the breath of something ancient and unseen. The tension was palpable, and for a moment, even Watson felt a quiet sense of unease, as though they had stumbled upon something that was not meant to be discovered. Holmes turned back to Millstone, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow, we will open the clock. There may be something inside, something that will reveal the truth. But be prepared, for the truth may not be what you expect." Millstone nodded, though his face remained pale. As Holmes and Watson prepared to leave the shop, the ticking continued, louder now, echoing through the room with a sense of urgency. It was as if the clock itself was trying to tell them something that had been locked away for far too long. And so, with each step they took away from the workshop, the mystery deepened. Time, it seemed, was not merely passing. It was speaking to them, calling them toward a secret that had remained hidden for generations. Chapter 3. A Family Secret. The day after their visit to Mr. Millstone's workshop, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson made their way to the Clockmaker's residence in the heart of London's older district. The sun, weak and pale through the thin layer of fog that blanketed the city, offered little warmth but illuminated the winding streets in a soft, muted light. The streets, though familiar, felt different now, as if something in the air had shifted and a quiet, unseen presence had begun to stir. As they walked, Watson couldn't help but glance at Holmes, who had been unusually quiet since their conversation with Millstone the night before. The mystery at hand seemed to occupy his thoughts entirely. His face, usually so animated when pondering a case, now wore an expression of deep concentration. His eyes, however, were sharper than ever, always scanning the environment around them, ever alert to the slightest detail. "Holmes," Watson ventured, his voice low as they walked side by side, "what do you make of Millstone's story?" The footsteps he heard. Do you believe it could be something other than his imagination? Holmes's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile as he glanced at Watson. "I believe, Watson, that we are dealing with more than just an old clock and the fancies of a troubled man. The footsteps, the strange behavior of the clock, the very atmosphere in that workshop. It is all connected, though I cannot yet see the full picture." "But what could it all mean?" Watson pressed, feeling a sense of unease as he spoke. "Could the clock itself be—" Holmes raised a hand, stopping Watson mid-sentence. "Not yet, my dear Watson. We are stepping into an intricate puzzle. We need more pieces before we can begin to assemble the whole." By the time they reached Mr. Millstone's house, the sky had darkened, though the fog lingered. The house itself was a modest two-story building, tucked away in a quiet alley. Millstone greeted them with a nod, though his demeanor was noticeably tense. "Come in, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice soft as though he feared being overheard. "I'm afraid I may have overlooked something important when I explained my father's connection to the clock." Holmes stepped inside, his mind already racing with possibilities. The air in the house was cool, with the faint scent of wood and oil lingering in the corners of the room. It was quiet here, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. This was the kind of silence that weighed heavily on the shoulders, making every small noise seem more significant than it truly was. Millstone led them to the study, where a fireplace burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A large oak desk stood against the wall, cluttered with papers and a few old clock parts. The room felt like it had been frozen in time, much like the clocks in Millstone's shop. "My father," Millstone began, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable sadness, "was an extraordinary man. A brilliant clockmaker, yes, but he was also a man of deep thoughts, perhaps too deep, I now realize." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He believed in time, Watson. Not just as a measurement of the hours and minutes, but as something far greater. He thought that by mastering time one could gain control over life itself." Watson blinked in surprise, glancing at Holmes, who seemed far more intrigued by the confession than alarmed. "Mastering time?" Watson echoed, incredulous. "That sounds impossible." Holmes took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Indeed it does, Watson. But we must remember that often the impossible is simply the misunderstood. Mr. Millstone, please, continue." Millstone hesitated for a moment before reaching into a drawer of the desk and pulling out a small, leather-bound journal. It looked worn and well used, as though it had been read many times. He handed it to Holmes, his hands trembling. "This was my father's journal," Millstone said softly. He wrote in it daily, detailing his thoughts on time, his experiments with the clock, and the changes he began to notice. I never paid it much attention until recently. After the clock began acting strange, I thought perhaps there was something in here that could explain it. Holmes opened the journal, the pages turning with a soft rustle as he flipped through them. His eyes moved quickly over the writing, some of it neat, some of it frantic, as if the thoughts of the clockmaker had become more scattered as time passed. He paused at a particularly well-worn page, where the ink seemed smudged, as though the writer had written and rewritten the same words several times. "It is written here," Holmes murmured, reading aloud. "Time is not a line. It is a circle, ever repeating. A clock can act as the key to unlocking this circle, allowing one to step outside of it." Holmes's voice trailed off as he closed the book gently, a glimmer of realization flickering in his eyes. Watson felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What does it mean, Holmes?" "I believe your father was not simply trying to measure time, Mr. Millstone. He was attempting to manipulate it, to break free from its natural constraints. And I believe that the clock he built was his key." Millstone's face went pale as Holmes spoke. "But why? What could he possibly have wanted with such a thing? Was it for immortality, to escape death?" His voice cracked on the last word. Holmes's expression softened, his gaze steady. "I do not think it was immortality, Mr. Millstone. I believe your father's intentions were far more personal. He wanted to control the flow of time, not to escape death, but perhaps to prevent it from reaching someone close to him." Millstone looked down at his hands, trembling. "My mother," he whispered. "She passed away when I was young. My father. He never quite recovered from her death. I've often wondered if that grief drove him to such extreme thoughts. Holmes nodded, understanding. Grief, Watson, can be a powerful motivator. It clouds the mind, pushes one to the edge of reason. It's clear that Mr. Millstone's father believed that by manipulating time, he could perhaps undo the past, or at least delay its inevitable consequences. Watson shivered, feeling a wave of unease wash over him. But if this is true, Holmes, what does it mean for the clock? And for Mr. Millstone? Holmes turned to Millstone, his voice soft but resolute. It means, Mr. Millstone, that your father's experiments may not have been confined to the past. It's possible that he left something behind in the clock, a mechanism or a message, that could reveal more about his intentions. But be warned, what your father began may not be as easily undone as you might hope. Millstone swallowed hard, his face pale. What should we do? We must open the clock, Holmes said firmly, but we must be prepared. There is no telling what we may find inside. The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire. As Holmes and Watson exchanged glances, the weight of the mystery settled upon them. The clock, the family secret, and the man who had tried to bend time itself. These were the pieces of the puzzle, and Holmes knew that they were not merely seeking an explanation. They were about to step into a world where the boundaries of time itself might begin to blur. And as the shadows grew longer, and the fog outside thickened, the quiet whisper of time seemed to draw ever closer. The truth was waiting, hidden in the clock, and soon they would have to face it. Chapter 4. The Hidden Path. The following day dawned clear, though a thin layer of mist still clung to the city's cobbled streets. The fog, however, had begun to lift, and London seemed to breathe once more, its towering buildings outlined against the pale sky. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, after a quiet breakfast, set off once again for Mr. Millstone's workshop. Their mission today was clear: to open the clock, to uncover its hidden secrets, and perhaps, in doing so, solve the mystery that had been haunting Millstone for so long. The walk to the shop was uneventful, yet Watson couldn't shake the unease that had been building in him since their conversation the night before. Millstone's father had been obsessed with controlling time, toying with the very fabric of reality. And now the clock itself seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for them. As they arrived at Millstone's shop, Holmes seemed unusually focused, his usual playful banter absent. He had donned his ever-present dark coat and his deerstalker hat, his sharp gaze never leaving the path ahead. Watson, ever his companion, followed closely, but a knot had formed in his stomach, an instinctive sense of foreboding. The shop was quiet today, its usual clamour of ticking clocks softened, almost as if the very room had grown tense in anticipation of their arrival. Millstone was already there, standing by the grandfather clock, his face pale and drawn, as though he hadn't slept a wink. Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson. He greeted them, his voice barely more than a whisper. I've been thinking about what we discussed. I fear the clock holds more than just mechanical mysteries. I think it may be connected to something darker, something my father never revealed to me. Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. We have to open it, Mr. Millstone. If there is something hidden within, we must uncover it. Time waits for no one, but sometimes it can trap us in ways we cannot understand. This clock, it may be the key to understanding what happened to your father, and perhaps to what is happening to you now. Millstone swallowed hard but nodded in agreement. I'm ready. The three of them gathered around the large, imposing clock,
its dark wood gleaming faintly in the dim light of the shop. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, as Holmes examined the intricate carvings once more. He ran his fingers along the edges of the clock face, his eyes flicking over the delicate ornate design, searching for something he had missed before. "Aha," Holmes murmured, his voice low and thoughtful. He moved with purpose, gently lifting the clock's pendulum and easing open the front cover. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, save for the soft, rhythmic ticking that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Watson stood back, feeling an odd sense of dread rise within him. It was as
though they had crossed a threshold, one they could not easily turn back from. He glanced at Millstone, who looked as if he might be sick with anticipation. Holmes, however, remained calm, his eyes sharp, focused. He reached into the clock's inner workings, his hands steady as he removed a small panel hidden behind the clock face. For a moment, the ticking seemed to pause, the air thick with a quiet expectation. Then Holmes spoke again, his voice carrying a note of certainty. There it is. The small compartment Holmes had uncovered held a peculiar object, an old faded map that appeared to be inscribed in a language Watson could not recognize. It was delicate, the edges fraying, as though it had been hidden away for many years. In the center of the map was a symbol, a circle, with lines radiating outward like rays of light. It looked almost otherworldly. Holmes studied the map for a long moment, his eyes scanning the strange symbols with the precision of a trained eye. "This is no ordinary map," he said finally, his voice calm yet filled with intrigue. "It's a map of sorts, but it's not a map of any place in this world. These symbols, they're ancient, almost mystical. And this symbol," he pointed to the circle in the center, "this is something I've seen before." Watson leaned in closer, squinting at the map. "What does it mean, Holmes?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully folded the map and slipped it into his coat pocket. "For now, Watson, I don't know. But I believe it's the key to understanding what your father was trying to do, Mr. Millstone. This map, along with the clock, is part of something much larger, something that transcends time as we know it." Millstone, whose face had grown paler still, looked at Holmes with a mix of confusion and fear. "But what does it mean for me? For the clock? What's happening to me?" Holmes turned slowly to face him, his expression unreadable. "That, Mr. Millstone, is the question we must answer. The clock is more than just a device to measure time. It is a conduit, a gateway, and your father, in his quest to control time, may have opened something that should have remained sealed." The room seemed to grow colder at Holmes's words, and Watson felt the weight of the moment settle heavily upon him. They had uncovered the first piece of the puzzle, but in doing so, they had only opened the door to something far darker and more complex than they could have imagined. The mystery of Millstone's father, his obsession with time, and the strange clock were all part of something far more dangerous, something they were only beginning to comprehend. As they stood in the shop, the ticking of the clocks grew louder, filling the air with an almost deafening rhythm. The quiet, once soothing, now seemed oppressive, the sound echoing in Watson's mind as though it were not just the passing of seconds, but something far more ominous. The clocks, once mere tools of measurement, had become the heartbeat of an ancient enigma. Holmes turned to Millstone, his gaze steady. "We will follow the map, Mr. Millstone. But be warned, we may not like what we find at the end of this path. Time has a way of revealing truths that are not easily borne." With that, Holmes carefully replaced the clock's panel and stepped back. The room fell into a heavy silence once again. Outside, the mist had begun to roll back in, the soft tendrils of fog creeping through the streets, as though the city itself were shrouding them in secrecy. As Watson and Holmes turned to leave, Watson couldn't help but glance back at the grandfather clock. The ticking, once so soothing, now felt like the ticking of a bomb, counting down to an inevitable revelation. And somewhere, in the depths of the shadows, he knew the clock was waiting for them to take the next step, to walk the hidden path that would lead them to the truth. And what truth that would be, Watson could not yet say. Chapter 5. The Timekeeper's Journal. The night that followed their discovery at the Clockmaker's workshop was one of rare, unsettling stillness. As Holmes and Watson made their way back to Baker Street, the fog had once again enveloped the streets, thickening with the promise of something hidden just beyond view. The light from the gas lamps struggled to cut through the mist, casting soft, diffused halos that barely illuminated the cobbled streets beneath their feet. Watson couldn't shake the unease that had begun to settle in his chest. The map, the cryptic symbols, the quiet ticking of the clocks, it all seemed to be leading them into deeper and darker waters, where time itself no longer felt like something they could control. It was a thing that slipped through their fingers, almost as though it had a mind of its own, waiting to be understood, or perhaps to be manipulated. Holmes, Watson finally spoke, breaking the silence that had fallen between them as they walked. What do you think of that map? The symbol in the center. It's like something out of mythology, or even an ancient religion. Holmes, as always, seemed lost in thought, his long strides never faltering. You're right, Watson, he replied, his voice low, thoughtful. The map is indeed peculiar. It doesn't match any cartographic system I'm familiar with. It's as though it was designed not to show places, but to reveal something more profound, something that transcends geography and enters into the realm of time and fate. Watson frowned, trying to digest what Holmes was saying. You mean, it's not a map at all? It's something else entirely? Holmes nodded, his eyes distant, as though already planning their next move. Precisely. It's a key, Watson, a key that unlocks the next part of this mystery, one that your father may have discovered long ago, Mr. Millstone. He paused, his voice growing softer. But we must be careful. If this clock is indeed part of a greater design, it may not be as harmless as it seems. We are stepping into territory where even time itself may not be the most reliable of guides. By the time they reached Baker Street, the fog had begun to thin, and the quiet of the night seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. Holmes, as always, had his mind set on the next step. As soon as they entered their rooms, he wasted no time in pulling out the small, leather-bound journal that Millstone had entrusted him with the day before. It was an old book, its cover cracked and worn with age, as if it had lived through many years, perhaps even centuries, of history. Holmes ran his fingers over the cover, his sharp eyes scanning every detail, even the faintest indentation. "This, Watson," he said, his voice filled with an air of reverence. "This is what we need. The Journal of Elias Whittaker. If anyone can shed light on this mystery, it will be this man." Watson leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "So, you believe that Whittaker knew something about this clock, about what it's truly capable of?" Holmes opened the journal carefully, as if handling a delicate artifact. "Indeed, Watson. Whittaker was not just a clockmaker. He was a man who sought to understand the very nature of time itself. I believe he left us clues within these pages, and perhaps, hidden among the pages of his journal, we will find the answers we seek." The journal was filled with dense, handwritten entries, some neat, some frantic, as if Whitaker had been writing in a frenzy. Holmes began to read aloud, his voice low and steady as he translated the ancient-looking script. Time is but a fleeting shadow, an illusion to the untrained mind. Yet, to those who understand its true nature, it becomes a weapon to mold the very fabric of existence. Holmes paused, his gaze thoughtful. A weapon, Watson. Whitaker saw time as something to be controlled, manipulated, rather than merely observed. Watson shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of the words. So, he wasn't just obsessed with creating a clock that measured time. He wanted to bend time itself to his will. Holmes continued, his finger tracing the lines of the page. Indeed. Here, Whitaker speaks of breaking the linearity of time and transcending the boundaries of mortality. It seems he was on the verge of something extraordinary, but there is a warning here too. Holmes's voice grew quieter, almost reverent. One who seeks to control time will never be free of it. Time will come to claim what is its own, and those who try to defy it will pay the price. A shiver ran down Watson's spine. A price? What kind of price? Holmes closed the journal gently and set it aside, his eyes dark with thought. That is what we must discover, Watson. I suspect that Whitaker's experiments weren't just theoretical. He may have opened something that now lingers, waiting to be unleashed. The room felt heavier now, the air thick with the weight of their discoveries. The journal had revealed more than Holmes had anticipated, but it had also deepened the mystery further. Whitaker had believed in time as something to be wielded, but the cautionary words in his journal hinted at something dangerous, something that had perhaps already been set in motion. Holmes stood abruptly, his mind already working at full speed. Watson, we need to go back to Millstone's shop. There may be something in that clock we've overlooked, something that is directly tied to Whitaker's experiments. Time, it seems, is not just something we observe. It is something we can manipulate. But at what cost? Watson stood as well, feeling a quiet sense of urgency creep over him. Holmes, what exactly are we walking into? If Whitaker was right, and this clock holds the power to manipulate time... Holmes turned to him, his gaze sharp, but his voice calming. We won't know until we investigate further, Watson. But remember, time is a master that cannot be escaped. We are but servants in its hands. The two men, accompanied by the growing weight of their discoveries, made their way once again toward the clockmaker's shop. The fog had thickened once more, and as they walked through the mist, the air around them seemed to grow colder, as if the very atmosphere were holding its breath, waiting for them to take the next step. Inside the shop, the familiar ticking of clocks filled the room. But today the ticking seemed louder, more insistent, as if the clocks themselves were waiting for something. Millstone stood by the grandfather clock, his face etched with worry and fear. Holmes approached the clock, his hands steady but his mind racing. He examined the gears, the delicate mechanisms that kept the hands turning in perfect harmony. But then, as his fingers brushed against one of the gears, something strange happened. The ticking stopped. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Holmes looked up, his eyes narrowing. It's begun. The clock had fallen silent, but what lay beneath its surface was far more than just a mechanical failure. Holmes had felt it. A shift in the air, a subtle change, like the briefest moment before a storm breaks. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, Watson knew that whatever was hidden within the clock was far more than a mere device. It was a doorway, one that they had now opened. Chapter 6. The Unseen Hand. The room was unnaturally quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the hundreds of clocks surrounding them. The familiar sound, once soothing, now echoed like the slow, inevitable march of time itself. Holmes stood before the grandfather clock, his eyes narrowed in concentration, while Dr. Watson stood a few paces behind, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and growing concern. Something had shifted, something unseen but deeply felt. The air in the shop felt thick, as if it were pressing in on them, and the very walls seemed to breathe with the clock's tick-tock. Holmes's hand hovered above the clock's face, his fingers poised, not quite touching the glass. For a long moment he stood perfectly still, his sharp eyes scanning the intricate gears and mechanisms within the clock. It had stopped, gone completely still, but not by accident. This was no ordinary malfunction. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of unease. "What's happening? Why has it stopped?" Holmes didn't answer immediately, but his brow furrowed. His sharp mind was piecing together the fragments of information they had uncovered so far, his thoughts racing ahead, trying to connect the dots. "It is not broken, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice steady, yet tinged with a subtle urgency. "This clock has stopped for a reason we have yet to fully understand." The tension in the room seemed to magnify with each passing second, and Watson found himself drawn toward the clock, though an uneasy feeling lingered in the pit of his stomach. There was something about it now, something strange and foreboding. The very idea that time could be manipulated, that it could be bent and twisted, felt almost unnatural, and yet Holmes was so certain of it. "I believe, Watson," Holmes continued, breaking the silence, "that this clock is no ordinary timepiece. It has been designed not to measure time, but to control it, perhaps even to manipulate it in ways that we cannot yet fathom." Watson blinked, his mind racing. Control time? But how could such a thing be possible? Holmes turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "It is not just about measuring hours and minutes, Watson. It is about bending those hours to one's will. Your father's obsession was not with making a clock that simply marked the passage of time. It was with making a clock that could alter time, and I suspect this clock may be the key to that power." For a moment, Watson didn't speak. The implications of Holmes's words weighed heavily in the air, like a silent storm ready to break. Could it be true? Could this clock truly have the power to influence time itself? The thought sent a chill creeping through Watson's spine, a sensation that felt far more real than any mere superstition. As if sensing Watson's mounting anxiety, Holmes added, "Time is not as constant as we think. It is not a linear path. It is fluid, and those who understand its true nature can shape it." Before Watson could respond, there was a soft click, almost imperceptible but loud enough to break the silence. Holmes's eyes flicked to the clock, his gaze sharp. "There," Holmes said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "Something has changed." Watson's heart skipped a beat. The clock, which had been completely still moments before, now began to move again. But this time the hands turned backward, slowly at first, then faster, as if being wound in reverse. Watson stepped back, his pulse quickening. "Holmes, what's happening? Is this normal? It's turning the wrong way." Holmes's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile, though his eyes betrayed a deeper concern. "Not normal, Watson. It's not merely malfunctioning. It's responding to something, or someone." The clock continued to turn backward, and with each tick, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening. It was as if the very fabric of time had been pulled apart, as if they were standing on the precipice of something both extraordinary and terrifying. Suddenly, a faint sound, so faint it was almost a whisper, broke through the growing tension in the room. It was the sound of footsteps, light but deliberate, moving just beyond the walls of the shop. At first, Watson thought it was a trick of the mind, a result of the strange atmosphere that seemed to hang in the air. But then the sound came again, closer this time. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the door, his face unreadable. Someone is here. Without warning, the door to the shop creaked open. A figure appeared in the doorway, cloaked in shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, with a face half obscured by a hood. His movements were deliberate, almost as if he were stepping into a room that he knew intimately, as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Watson instinctively stepped forward, but Holmes held up a hand, signaling for him to stay back. The man stepped further into the shop, his eyes locking onto Holmes with an unsettling intensity. "You've opened it," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of something darker, something older. "I knew you would. I've been waiting for this." Holmes studied the man carefully, his eyes narrowing. "And who, may I ask, are you?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "Someone who understands the true nature of time. Someone who has been watching over this clock for longer than you realize." Watson felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The air in the room grew even colder, and the ticking of the clock seemed to echo louder, as if responding to the man's presence. Holmes took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You've been watching, you say? And what is it that you hope to achieve?" The man's smile faded, and for the first time there was a flicker of something more dangerous in his eyes. "I have no hope, Mr. Holmes. I have only purpose. This clock was never meant to be tampered with. But now that you've opened it, now that you've triggered its power, you've set something in motion." Holmes stood still, his mind racing, his thoughts as sharp as ever. "What power?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with quiet urgency. The man stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a shadow. "The power to alter time itself. But you will soon realize that time is not so easily manipulated. Once you open this door, you cannot close it again. You will be forced to follow its path, and time will never be the same for you again." As the man finished speaking, the clock behind him struck a deep, resonant chime. The sound reverberated through the room, shaking the very air itself. Each chime felt like the passing of an age, each one heavier than the last. Holmes turned slowly to Watson, his eyes dark with realization. "It has begun, Watson. The clock has not only opened a door, it has unlocked something far more dangerous than we imagined." The man smiled one last time before stepping back into the shadows, his figure disappearing as the door closed behind him with a soft, final click. And as the ticking of the clock resumed, louder than ever, Holmes knew that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no turning back. Chapter 7. The Clock's Secret. The night had deepened into an oppressive silence, thick and heavy, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Holmes and Watson stood in the middle of the clockmaker's shop, their eyes still locked on the spot where the mysterious man had vanished only moments before. The air seemed to shimmer with something unseen, something powerful and ancient. The quiet ticking of the clocks around them now felt like the ticking of a time bomb, counting down to something inevitable. The man's words echoed in Watson's mind, repeating like a haunting refrain. "Once you open this door, you cannot close it again." The weight of that statement pressed down on him, and he found himself wondering what it truly meant. Had they unwittingly unleashed something far darker than they could understand? Holmes, as always, remained calm. His eyes were narrowed, his brow furrowed in deep thought as he studied the space around them. The room, which had once felt cozy and familiar, now seemed cold and unfamiliar, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice tinged with unease. "Do you think he was telling the truth? About the clock? About what it can do?" Holmes didn't respond immediately. He was still staring at the clock, his mind working furiously, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. He had known from the beginning that this case would take them to dangerous and uncharted waters. But now, with the appearance of that man, the mystery had deepened in ways they hadn't expected. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low and steady. "I believe we've opened a door, Watson. But I don't believe it is one we can simply close. This clock, it was never meant to be understood by ordinary men. It was designed with a purpose, one that transcends what we know of time and its workings. Whitaker's journal, the map, even the strange symbol. I now believe they were meant to guide us here, to this moment." Watson glanced at the clock, his gaze lingering on its hands, which had now stopped moving entirely. It was as though the clock was frozen in time, suspended between the past and the future. The silence in the room felt unbearable, as though something were lurking just beyond their reach. "Then what do we do now?" Watson asked, his voice barely a whisper. Holmes turned to him, his eyes piercing, filled with the intensity of someone who had made a discovery far larger than he had anticipated. "We need to understand what the clock is truly capable of. It's not just a timepiece, Watson. It's a key to something far beyond our comprehension. And if we don't unlock its secret, if we don't control it..." He trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, more insistent, pressing in on them as if they were being pushed forward into something they could not see. Holmes stepped forward and gently placed his hand on the clock's face once more. The surface was cold, like the stone of an ancient tomb, and as his fingers brushed against the glass, he felt a faint vibration, a pulse that seemed to hum beneath the surface. "There's something here," Holmes muttered, almost to himself, his voice filled with an intense focus. "Something waiting to be uncovered." As he carefully examined the clock's inner workings, Watson watched, his heart pounding in his chest. The strange sensation that had gripped him since the moment the man had appeared was growing stronger. Something was wrong with the very fabric of time in this room. The clocks had stopped, but not in the way they should have. This wasn't a mechanical failure. It was as if the clocks had been deliberately frozen, suspended in a moment that refused to end. Holmes worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision as he opened the back of the clock. He removed the mechanism with care, his eyes scanning each part, looking for something, anything that might explain the strange events. He paused when his fingers brushed against something unusual, something hidden in the very heart of the clock. "What is it, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice thick with anticipation. Holmes carefully pulled out a small folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. The paper was fragile, almost disintegrating at the touch, but Holmes unfolded it with great care. The writing on the paper was scrawled in a hurried hand, the ink faint and smudged, as though written in a moment of panic. Holmes read aloud, his voice soft but steady. "To anyone who finds this, beware. The clock is not just a machine. It is a living thing. It feeds on time, bends it, distorts it. Those who have tried to use it have lost themselves within its grasp, trapped in a loop of endless moments. Time is a prison, and this clock is its warden. If you continue, You will lose more than just your mind. You will lose yourself. You will lose everything. Do not unlock the door that this clock hides, for once it is opened, there is no returning. The room fell into a deep silence as Holmes finished reading. Watson felt his heart race in his chest, the weight of the warning settling over him like a suffocating fog. "This," Watson began, his voice tight with apprehension. "This is it, isn't it? The clock, it has a power we don't understand, and whatever we've set in motion we can't undo." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, Watson. This clock was never meant to be tampered with. It is not a tool to be understood by men like us. It is something far older, far more dangerous. And now that we've opened it, we must face the consequences." Watson felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he looked around the shop. The ticking had started again, faint at first but growing louder, as if the clocks were responding to the events unfolding before them. The air seemed to hum with an energy that made his skin crawl. Holmes turned to face him, his eyes dark with determination. "We have no choice now, Watson. The clock has revealed its secret, and we must uncover the full extent of its power. We need to find out what happens next. But we must proceed with caution. Time is not a thing we can control. It is a thing we must understand." As Holmes began to examine the clock's inner workings again, Watson stood back, watching the detective's every move with a sense of dread and awe. The clock had begun to turn once more, slowly, almost as if it were testing them, toying with them. The moment felt suspended in time, as though they were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into a world they could never return from. The clocks around them ticked on relentlessly, each tick echoing like the beating of a heart, each one counting down to an uncertain future. The mystery was deepening, and yet, at the same time, it was becoming clearer than ever. The clock was not just a puzzle to be solved. It was a force that was shaping their fate, whether they understood it or not. And the only thing they could do now was continue forward. Chapter 8. The Underground Chamber. The atmosphere in the shop had thickened with an almost oppressive silence, and the soft ticking of the clocks now felt like a constant companion, an echo of time itself. Holmes stood before the grandfather clock, his hands lightly resting on the wood, eyes closed for a brief moment as if listening for something beyond the mechanical noise. Watson, standing a few steps behind, felt the weight of the mystery pressing in on him, his mind unable to shake the haunting image of the warning from Whitaker's journal. The clock, it seemed, was more than a timepiece. It was a portal, a key to something much larger, something that both drew them in and repelled them at the same time. The soft glow of gas lamps flickered in the dim room, casting long shadows across the clocks that lined the walls. Despite the faint hum of the city outside, the shop had an almost timeless quality, like a place suspended between worlds. The only sound now was the ticking of the clocks, which seemed louder than ever, as if the shop itself were holding its breath. Holmes broke the silence with a quiet murmur, his voice tinged with both caution and resolve. "The clock is not just a machine, Watson. It is a vessel, one that holds more than mere gears and springs. It has been designed to carry something that we cannot yet fully comprehend." Watson, feeling a knot tighten in his chest, asked, "What do you mean, Holmes?" "Something like what?" Holmes did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the clock as he studied its face with an almost reverential focus. His hand brushed lightly over the carvings again, searching for something, some hidden trigger, some subtle detail that might unlock the mystery they were about to face. Then, as if in response to his touch, a faint click echoed through the room. Watson's heart skipped a beat. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the back of the clock, where a hidden panel previously unnoticed began to slide open. It moved slowly at first, then more quickly, as though something inside was being unlocked. The wooden door that had once sealed the clock now stood ajar, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase leading down into the shadows beneath the floorboards. Holmes stepped forward, his face illuminated only by the flickering light of the gas lamps. He turned to Watson, his expression unreadable but intense. "This is it, Watson." The path we've been searching for. Watson felt a cold chill rush through him as he stepped toward the stairs. The air in the shop seemed to grow colder with each step, the temperature dropping as though the very passage of time itself had slowed. The ticking of the clocks became faint, almost muffled, as if they were retreating into the distance. And though the stairwell was dark, a faint glow beckoned from below, a subtle, unsettling light that promised to reveal something they were not yet ready to understand. As they descended into the darkness, Watson's pulse quickened, his breath forming visible clouds in the cold air. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly, winding downward into the unknown. Each step creaked underfoot, and the deeper they went, the more the world above seemed to fade, replaced by a thick silence that was almost suffocating. The glow grew brighter, and soon they reached the bottom of the staircase. The chamber they found themselves in was unlike anything Watson could have imagined. The walls were lined with ancient, worn bookshelves filled with dusty volumes, many of them completely unreadable, their spines cracked and fragile with age. A faint scent of old parchment and candle wax lingered in the air. At the center of the room stood a large circular table. On it lay a single open book, its pages yellowed with age, its words inscribed in an ancient flowing script that seemed almost to shimmer in the dim light. Surrounding the table were several tall, blackened candles, each one burning steadily despite the stillness in the room. The flames flickered but did not waver, as though they were not being fed by air but by some other unseen force. Holmes approached the table slowly, his eyes scanning the book with a sense of reverence. "This is it," he murmured, his voice reverberating in the silence of the room. "The key to Whitaker's work." The clock was never just a timepiece. It was part of a much larger experiment. An experiment with the fabric of time itself. Watson stepped forward, his hand brushing lightly over the worn edges of the book. It was as if the very air around them was heavy with ancient knowledge, and he felt the weight of centuries pressing in on him. The room seemed to hold a secret so powerful that it threatened to break free from its confines at any moment. Holmes flipped the book open to the page marked with a faded ribbon. The writing on the pages seemed to move, shifting and changing, as though it were alive, responding to their presence. "This," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is a journal of sorts, a record of Whitaker's work, his experiments with time." Watson leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the page. The words were written in a language he didn't understand, but he could feel their weight, their meaning, as if they were seeping into his mind, trying to communicate something he wasn't ready to grasp. There, in the center of the page, was a drawing, a depiction of a clock, but not a clock like any they had seen before. This one had an intricate, almost otherworldly design, its gears and hands spiraling outward, forming a complex web that seemed to hold the world together. Holmes ran his fingers along the edges of the page, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. "This clock," he said softly, "was designed not just to measure time, but to manipulate it, to shape it to the will of the one who controls it." Whitaker believed that by harnessing time, one could bend reality itself. Watson took a step back, his mind racing to process the information. Bend reality? You mean this clock could... Holmes's gaze met his eyes filled with both awe and fear. Yes, Watson. This clock was not just a tool. It was a weapon that could alter time itself. And by unlocking it, we may have set something in motion that can never be undone. The room seemed to darken as Holmes spoke, the shadows shifting unnaturally. For a moment, Watson thought he saw the candles flicker and dim, as though the very light in the room was being drained away. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though they were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room dropped even further. Watson could see his breath in the air, swirling in the dim light. The sound of the ticking clocks above them had returned, but now it was distorted, warped, slow, deliberate, as if time itself was being stretched and pulled in unnatural ways. Holmes turned to Watson, his face grim. We must be careful now. The clock has already begun to react. We've opened the door, but what lies beyond it, what it holds, remains uncertain. A sudden, sharp noise broke the silence, like the sound of something cracking, splintering. Watson turned toward the source of the sound, his heart racing. At the far side of the chamber, a large stone door had begun to creak open, as though it had been waiting for them all along. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the door. It seems our journey is far from over, and what lies beyond that door? He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. May be the true heart of Whitaker's experiment. With that, the door creaked wider, revealing a dark passage that stretched into the unknown, pulling them deeper into the mystery that had already begun to unravel their world. Chapter 9. The Labyrinth of Time. The cold air of the underground chamber clung to Watson's skin, his breath visible in the faint light cast by the candles around them. Holmes had already stepped forward, his eyes narrowed, his mind working furiously. The stone door that had creaked open before them revealed a narrow passageway, its walls lined with shadows that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. The path was dark and seemed to stretch infinitely into the unknown, a gateway to something far greater and far more dangerous than they had yet encountered. Holmes turned to Watson, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable urgency. We are beyond the point of no return now, Watson. The clock has shown us its power, and this door, he gestured toward the narrow passage, is the key to understanding how far Whitaker went in his attempts to control time itself. We must proceed cautiously. Watson swallowed, feeling the weight of Holmes's words settle heavily in his chest. The passage ahead was filled with mystery, but it was also a pathway into a darkness they had barely begun to understand. The air seemed to hum with a strange, oppressive energy, as if the very walls of the chamber were alive, pulsating with the unseen power of time itself. The passage was long, its stone walls slick with moisture, and the floor beneath their feet felt uneven, as though the ground had shifted and settled in ways that defied natural laws. The further they walked, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. It was as though they had stepped out of time altogether, entering a place where the usual rules no longer applied. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the faint ticking of the clocks from above them grew fainter, until it was nearly drowned out by the steady beat of their own hearts. The sound of footsteps echoed in the silence, each step carrying a sense of inevitability, as though they were walking toward something that had already been set in motion long ago. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a large circular chamber. In the center stood a pedestal, and upon it rested an object covered by a heavy cloth. The room was bathed in a soft, ethereal glow, as though it were illuminated by an unseen source. The walls around them were lined with more shelves, each filled with dusty tomes and strange instruments, many of which Watson couldn't begin to identify. But all of it seemed to draw them toward the pedestal, toward the object that awaited them there. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room carefully. He moved toward the pedestal with deliberate steps, his gaze fixed on the object beneath the cloth. Watson followed closely behind, his heart pounding with anticipation. Holmes reached out and slowly pulled back the cloth. What they saw before them made Watson's breath catch in his throat. It was a clock, but not like any clock he had ever seen. Its design was complex, far more intricate than the grandfather clock they had been studying. The hands of the clock seemed to shimmer, not solid but fluid, twisting and curling like tendrils of smoke. The clock face itself was adorned with strange symbols, many of which Watson recognized from the map they had uncovered earlier, but now they seemed even more ominous, as though they were watching him, judging him. Holmes stepped back, his expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. "This is it, Watson," he whispered. "This is the heart of Whitaker's experiment. The clock was never just a timepiece. It was a conduit, a vessel, and within it lies the power to bend time itself." Watson looked at Holmes, his mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of what they had found. But how? How could something like this exist? How could Whitaker? Holmes interrupted him, his voice steady, but filled with quiet certainty. "Whitaker didn't just build clocks, Watson. He sought to control time, to understand its true nature. This clock is the culmination of that obsession. It's a map, a guide to something far more powerful than we can imagine. And I fear that in unlocking it, we may have unleashed forces we cannot control." The ticking of the clock before them had started once again, but it was different now, more erratic, more pronounced. The hands of the clock moved faster than any ordinary timepiece should, their motion impossibly fluid, as though time itself were bending and breaking at their touch. Watson's gaze shifted to the shelves around them, his eyes scanning the countless books and papers that littered the room. There was a sense of urgency in the air now, a feeling that time was slipping away from them. Every second felt like an eternity. Holmes turned to Watson, his face drawn, his eyes sharp with determination. "We cannot leave this place without understanding what this clock holds. Whitaker left us a trail that we must follow, no matter the cost. We've come this far, Watson. We cannot turn back now." As Holmes moved toward the clock, Watson stepped closer, his pulse quickening. The air in the room seemed to hum with energy, the very space around them vibrating as though the clock was alive, as though it were waiting for something. Holmes reached out and touched the clock's face, his fingers brushing against the shimmering hands. The moment his skin made contact, the room seemed to shake, as though the world itself were bending under the force of the clock's power. The symbols on the clock face began to glow, their light pulsing in time with the ticking. And then, without warning, the clock began to speak, not in words but in sounds, in vibrations that resonated deep within Watson's chest. Watson felt a pressure in his mind, as though something were trying to break through, to reach into his very thoughts. The world around him seemed to distort, the walls of the chamber warping and stretching as though time itself were warping under the clock's influence. Holmes stepped back quickly, his eyes wide with shock. "It's happening, Watson. Time is not a constant here. It's bending, breaking apart. We've opened a door, and now we must face what lies beyond it." The room seemed to tilt, the floor beneath them shifting as though the very fabric of reality was coming undone. Watson reached out to steady himself, but his hand passed through the air as if it were nothing more than a mirage. The clock continued to tick faster, its hands spinning now in wild abandon, as if it were reaching for something beyond their comprehension. Then, with a sudden deafening crash, everything stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence. The clock's hands ceased moving. The light in the chamber faded, and the strange vibrations in the air slowly dissipated. For a moment, Watson thought that time itself had collapsed, that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. But as he glanced around the room, he realized that something had changed. The objects on the shelves were now different, older, dustier. The book that had been open before them had shifted, its pages now yellowed and worn, as though it had existed for centuries. Holmes turned to Watson, his face pale but resolute. "We've triggered something, Watson. The clock has shown us its true power, but I fear what comes next may be beyond our understanding." Watson looked at the clock again, his mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. Time, it seemed, was no longer a simple measure of seconds and minutes. It had become something far more fluid, far more dangerous. And as they stood there, in the heart of Whitaker's secret chamber, Watson knew that whatever had been set in motion could never be undone. Chapter 10. The Door to Eternity. The stillness of the chamber was almost deafening, and yet the very air around them seemed to hum with an energy that wasn't quite visible, yet palpable. Holmes and Watson stood in the heart of the underground room, staring at the now silent clock that had once ticked faster than the human mind could process. The chamber around them, once glowing with the eerie pulse of time's distortion, had gone deathly quiet. The strange, surreal feeling that had filled the space moments before had dissipated, leaving behind a thick, heavy silence. Watson's breath came slowly, his heart still racing from the inexplicable events they had just witnessed. The world felt off-kilter, as if they had entered a space where the rules of time and reality no longer applied. His eyes moved from the clock, still and unnervingly quiet now, to Holmes, whose sharp gaze never wavered. It was clear that Holmes was still processing, still trying to make sense of the incomprehensible force they had just unleashed. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the delicate balance of the moment. "What just happened?" The clock, it stopped, and then everything shifted. It's as though we've moved beyond time itself. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to the pedestal where the clock stood, his fingers hovering near its surface. There was no ticking now, no hum of energy, nothing except a faint aura of something ancient and forgotten. Holmes paused, as if listening for something just beyond hearing. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice filled with the quiet certainty that Watson had come to recognize in his most intense moments. "We've opened something, Watson. And I fear we may have opened more than just a door. The clock was never just a tool. It was a gateway. It has allowed us to step beyond the limitations of time, to a place where past, present, and future no longer hold sway." A shiver ran down Watson's spine at Holmes's words. He had always known that time was a powerful force. But now, with this clock, it seemed more like a living entity, something that could be bent, twisted, and reshaped by the hands of those brave or foolish enough to seek its secrets. "Are you saying," Watson began, struggling to make sense of it, "that we're outside time, that what we're seeing is something beyond the normal flow of seconds and minutes?" Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the clock. "Not entirely outside time, Watson. But we've crossed a threshold. This clock, it doesn't just measure time, it manipulates it. What we've seen in the chamber, the glow, the vibrations, the pulse of energy, it was the clock attempting to bridge the divide between the physical world and something beyond What lies beyond that bridge is something I do not yet fully understand. The silence that followed hung heavy in the air, as if even the chamber itself were contemplating the enormity of their discovery. Holmes moved carefully around the room, his sharp eyes scanning the walls, the shelves, the ancient books that lined the shelves. It was as though he was searching for some clue, some missing piece of the puzzle that would make sense of what they had just experienced. Suddenly, his eyes flicked to the far side of the room, where the stone door they had entered through stood slightly ajar. Watson followed his gaze, but no sound came from the other side. The air in the room felt still, frozen. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "There's something more, Watson. I can feel it." Without a word, Holmes moved toward the door, stepping carefully across the cold, uneven floor. Watson followed closely behind, his mind racing with questions. What did Holmes sense? What was it that they hadn't yet discovered? They reached the door and Holmes paused, hand on the handle. He turned to Watson, his expression unreadable. The clock was only part of the puzzle. Whitaker, he may have thought he was unlocking time's secrets, but I believe he was only scratching the surface. What lies beyond this door could answer the questions we've been asking, but it may also reveal something far more dangerous. With a quiet click, Holmes pushed the door open. What lay beyond was not what Watson had expected. The room they entered was vast, its ceiling stretching high above them, lost in the shadows. The air was colder here, and the silence was even more profound. This room felt ancient, untouched by time, its walls covered in thick layers of dust, its floor cold stone, worn by the passage of centuries. But what caught Watson's eye was what stood at the center of the room, a massive, gleaming sphere, suspended in mid-air by no visible means. Its surface shimmered, almost alive, as though it were made of liquid metal. Holmes stepped forward, his hand still resting on his chin, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This," he murmured, "is what Whitaker sought. The key to controlling time itself. The clock was merely a device to focus the energy, to direct it toward this orb." The orb pulsed faintly, its surface rippling in time with the distant, irregular ticking of the clocks. As Watson watched, a wave of light, soft, golden, radiated from the orb, filling the room with an otherworldly glow. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop entirely. The air itself felt suspended, frozen in a moment of eternity. "It's beautiful," Watson whispered, though the words didn't quite capture what he was feeling. The orb was mesmerizing, hypnotic in its glow, its presence almost overwhelming. Holmes turned to him, his expression both serious and grim. "It is not just beautiful, Watson. It is powerful. This orb is a conduit. It holds the potential to bend time, to alter history, to stretch and twist the very fabric of reality. But there is a cost." A sense of dread washed over Watson as he listened. He could feel it now, the weight of the orb's power, the danger it posed, and the terrifying possibility that once activated, there would be no way to control what came next. Holmes took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the orb. This was Whitaker's ultimate creation. He didn't just want to understand time, he wanted to master it. But as with all such obsessions, there is a price to pay for playing with forces beyond our control. And now that the clock has unlocked this place, we are too far in to turn back. As Holmes stood there contemplating the orb, Watson felt the air around them begin to hum. The ticking, once faint, grew louder, more insistent. The clocks above in the shop seemed to come alive with an energy of their own, their ticking increasing in speed, growing chaotic. "We've triggered something," Holmes said softly, turning to face Watson. something we may not be able to stop. Before Watson could respond, a low, distant rumble shook the floor beneath their feet, and the room seemed to shift, the air warping around them. The orb began to glow brighter, its light intensifying until it filled the entire chamber. Holmes took a step back, his eyes wide, a flicker of realization passing over his face. It's beginning. Time, as Watson had known it, was no longer the same. And as the orb pulsed with energy, he understood there was no going back. They had opened a door to a world where time could be controlled, shaped, and distorted. And in doing so, they had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return.